The Diary of a Nobody by George and Weedon Grossmith. Read for LibriVox.org by Martin Clifton. Chapter 7. Home again. Mr. James' influence on Carrie. Can get nothing for Lupin. Next door neighbours are a little troublesome. Someone tampers with my diary. Lupin startles us with an announcement. August the 22nd. Home, sweet home again. Carrie brought some pretty blue wool mats to stand vases on. Fripps, Janus & Co. write to say they are sorry they have no vacancy among their staff of clerks for Lupin. August the 23rd. I bought a pair of stag's heads made of plaster of Paris and coloured brown. They will look just the thing for our little hall and give it style. The heads are excellent imitations. Poolers and Smith are sorry they have nothing to offer Lupin. August the 24th. Simply to please Lupin and make things cheerful for him, as he is a little down, Carrie invited Mrs. James to come up from Sutton and spend 2 or 3 days with us. We have not said a word to Lupin, but mean to keep it as a surprise. August the 25th. Mrs. James of Sutton arrived in the afternoon, bringing with her an enormous bunch of wild flowers. The more I see of Mrs. James, the nicer I think she is, and she is devoted to Carrie. She went into Carrie's room to take off her bonnet, and remained there nearly an hour talking about dress. Lupin said he was not a bit surprised at Mrs. James' visit, but was surprised at her. August the 26th, Sunday. Nearly late for church, Mrs. James having talked considerably about what to wear all the morning. Lupin does not seem to get on very well with Mrs. James. I'm afraid we shall have some trouble with our next-door neighbours who came in last Wednesday. Several of their friends who drive up in dog-carts have already made themselves objectionable. An evening or two ago I had put on a white waistcoat for coolness, and while walking past with my thumbs in my waistcoat pockets, a habit I have, one man, seated in the cart and looking like an American, commenced singing some vulgar nonsense about I had $13 in my waistcoat pocket. I fancied it was meant for me, and my suspicions were confirmed, for while walking around the garden in my tall hat this afternoon, a throw-down cracker was deliberately aimed at my hat and exploded on it like a percussion cap. I turned sharply, and am positive I saw the man who was in the cart retreating from one of the bedroom windows. August the 27th. Carrie and Mrs. James went off shopping, and had not returned when I came back from the office. Judging from the subsequent conversation, I am afraid Mrs. James is filling Carrie's head with a lot of nonsense about dress. I walked over to Gowing's and asked him to drop in to supper and make things pleasant. Carrie prepared a little extemporised supper consisting of the remainder of the cold joint, a small piece of salmon, which I was to refuse in case there was not enough to go round, and a blancmange and custards. There was also a decanter of port and some jam puffs on the sideboard. Mrs. James made us play rather a good game of cards called muggings. To my surprise, in fact disgust, Lupin got up in the middle and, in a most sarcastic tone, said, "Pardon me, this sort of thing is too fast for me. I shall go and enjoy a quiet game of marbles in the back garden." Things might have become rather disagreeable but for Gowing, who seems to have taken to Lupin, suggesting they should invent games. Lupin said, "Let's play monkeys." He then led Gowing all round the room and brought him in front of the looking-glass. I must confess I laughed heartily at this. I was a little vexed at everybody subsequently laughing at some joke which they did not explain, and it was only on going to bed I discovered I must have been walking about all the evening with an antimacassar on one button of my coat-tails. August the 28th found a large brick in the middle bed of geraniums, evidently come from next door. Pattles and Pattles can't find a place for Lupin. August the 29th. Mrs. James is making a positive fool of Carrie. Carrie appeared in a new dress like a smock frock. She said smocking was all the rage. I replied, "It put me in a rage." She also had on a hat as big as a kitchen coal scuttle, and the same shape. Mrs. James went home, and both Lupin and I were somewhat pleased. The first time we have agreed on a single subject since his return. Merkins and Son write they have no vacancy for Lupin. October 30th. I should very much like to know who has wilfully torn the last 5 or 6 weeks out of my diary. It is perfectly monstrous. Mine is a large scribbling diary with plenty of space for the record of my everyday events, and in keeping up that record I take, with much pride, a great deal of pains. I asked Carrie if she knew anything about it. She replied it was my own fault for leaving the diary about with a charwoman cleaning and the sweeps in the house. I said that was not an answer to my question. This retort of mine, which I thought extremely smart, would have been more effective had I not jogged my elbow against a vase on a table, temporarily placed in the passage, knocked it over and smashed it. Carrie was dreadfully upset at this disaster, for it was one of a pair of vases which cannot be matched, given to us on our wedding day by Mrs. Bursett, an old friend of Carrie's cousins, the Pomertons, late of Dalston. I called to Sarah and asked her about the diary. She said she had not been in the sitting-room at all. After the sweep had left, Mrs. Birrell, the charwoman, had cleaned the room and lighted the fire herself. Finding a burnt piece of paper in the grate, I examined it and found it was a piece of my diary, so it was evident someone had torn my diary to light the fire. I requested Mrs. Birrell to be sent to me tomorrow. October 31st. Received a letter from our principal, Mr. Perkupp, saying that he thinks he knows of a place at last for our dear boy Lupin. This, in a measure, consoles me for the loss of a portion of my diary, for I am bound to confess the last few weeks have been devoted to the record of disappointing answers received from people to whom I have applied for appointments for Lupin. Mrs. Birrell called, and, in reply to me, said she never see no book, much less take such a liberty as touch it. I said I was determined to find out who did it, whereupon she said she would do her best to help me, but she remembered the sweep lighting the fire with a bit of the echo. I requested the sweep to be sent to me tomorrow. I wish Carrie had not given Lupin a latchkey. We never seemed to see anything of him. I sat up till past 1 for him, and then retired, tired. November 1st. My entry yesterday about tired, which I did not notice at the time, is rather funny. If I were not so worried just now, I might have had a little joke about it. The sweep called, but had the audacity to come up to the hall door and lean his dirty bag of soot on the doorstep. He, however, was so polite I could not rebuke him. He said Sarah lighted the fire. Unfortunately, Sarah heard this, for she was dusting the banisters, and she ran down and flew into a temper with the sweep, causing a row on the front doorsteps, which I would not have had happen for anything. I ordered her about her business, and told the sweep I was sorry to have troubled him. And so I was, for the doorsteps were covered with soot in consequence of his visit. I would willingly give 10 shillings to find out who tore my diary. November 2nd. I spent the evening quietly with Carrie, of whose company I never tire. We had a most pleasant chat about the letters on "Is Marriage a Failure?" It has been no failure in our case. In talking over our own happy experiences, we never noticed that it was past midnight. We were startled by hearing the door slam violently. Lupin had come in. He made no attempt to turn down the gas in the passage, or even to look into the room where we were, but went straight up to bed, making a terrible noise. I asked him to come down for a moment, and he begged to be excused, as he was dead beat, an observation that was scarcely consistent with the fact that, for a quarter of an hour afterwards, he was positively dancing in his room and shouting out, "See me dance the polka," or some such nonsense. November 3rd. Good news at last. Mr. Perkupp has got an appointment for Lupin, and he is to go and see him about it on Monday. Oh, how my mind is relieved! I went to Lupin's room to take the good news to him, but he was in bed, very seedy, so I resolved to keep it over till the evening. He said he had, last night, been elected a member of an amateur dramatic club called the Holloway Comedians, and though it was a pleasant evening, he had sat in a draught and got neuralgia in the head. He declined to have any breakfast, so I left him. In the evening I had up a special bottle of port, and, Lupin being in for a wonder, we filled our glasses, and I said, "Lupin, my boy, I have some good and unexpected news for you. Mr. Perkupp has procured you an appointment." Lupin said, "Good biz," and we drained our glasses. Lupin then said, "Fill up the glasses again, for I have some good and unexpected news for you." I had some slight misgivings, and so evidently had Carrie, for she said, "I hope we shall think it good news." Lupin said, "Oh, it's all right. I'm engaged to be married." End of chapter. The Diary of a Nobody by George and Weedon Grossmith. Read for LibriVox.org by Martin Clifton. Chapter 8. Daisy Mutlar, sole topic of conversation. Lupin's new birth. Fireworks at the Cummings. The Holloway Comedians. Sarah quarrels with the charwoman. Lupin's uncalled for interference. Am introduced to Daisy Mutlar. We decide to give a party in her honour. November 5th, Sunday. Carrie and I troubled about that mere boy Lupin getting engaged to be married without consulting us or anything. After dinner he told us all about it. He said the lady's name was Daisy Mutlar, and she was the nicest, prettiest, and most accomplished girl he ever met. He loved her the moment he saw her, and if he had to wait 50 years, he would wait, and he knew she would wait for him. Lupin further said, with much warmth, that the world was a different place to him now. It was a world worth living in. He lived with an object now, and that was to make Daisy Mutlar Daisy Pooter, and he would guarantee she would not disgrace the family of the Pooters. Carrie here burst out crying, and threw her arms round his neck, and in doing so upset the glass of port he held in his hand all over his new light trousers. I said I had no doubt we should like Miss Mutlar when we saw her, but Carrie said she loved her already. I thought this rather premature, but held my tongue. Daisy Mutlar was the sole topic of conversation for the remainder of the day. I asked Lupin who her people were, and he replied, "Oh, you know, Mutlar, Williams and Watts." I did not know, but refrained from asking him any further questions at present for fear of irritating Lupin. November 6th. Lupin went with me to the office, and had a long conversation with Mr. Perkupp, our principal, the result of which was that he accepted a clerkship in the firm of Job, Cleanands and Co., stock and share brokers. Lupin told me privately it was an advertising firm, and he did not think much of it. I replied, "Beggars should not be choosers," and I will do Lupin the justice to say he looked rather ashamed of himself. In the evening we went round to the Cummings to have a few fireworks. It began to rain, and I thought it rather dull. One of my squibs would not go off, and Gowing said, "Hit it on your boot, boy, it'll go off then." I gave it a few knocks on the end of my boot, and it went off with one loud explosion, and burnt my fingers rather badly. I gave the rest of the squibs to the little Cummings boy to let off. Another unfortunate thing happened, which brought a heap of abuse on my head. Cummings fastened a large wheel set-piece on a stake in the ground by way of a grand finale. He made a great fuss about it, said it had cost 7 shillings. There was a little difficulty in getting it to light. At last it went off, but after a couple of slow revolutions it stopped. I had my stick with me, so I gave it a tap to send it round, and, unfortunately, it fell off the stake onto the grass. Anybody would have thought I had set the house on fire from the way in which they stormed at me. I will never join in any more fireworks parties. It is a ridiculous waste of time and money. November 7th. Lupin asked Carrie to call on Mrs. Mutlar, but Carrie said she thought Mrs. Mutlar ought to call on her first. I agreed with Carrie, and this led to an argument. However, the matter was settled by Carrie saying she could not find any visiting cards, and we must get some more printed, and when they were finished would be quite time enough to discuss the etiquette of calling. November 8th. I ordered some of our cards at Black's, the stationers. I ordered 25 of each, which will last us for a good long time. In the evening, Lupin brought in Frank Mutlar, Miss Mutlar's brother. He was a rather gawky youth, and Lupin said he was the most popular and best amateur in the club, referring to the Holloway comedians. Lupin whispered to us that if we could only draw out Frank a bit, he would make us roar with laughter. At supper, young Mutlar did several amusing things. He took up a knife, and with the flat part of it played a tune on his cheek in a wonderful manner. He also gave an imitation of an old man with no teeth, smoking a big cigar. The way he kept dropping the cigar sent Carrie into fits. In the course of conversation, Daisy's name cropped up, and young Mutlar said he would bring his sister round to us one evening, his parents being rather old-fashioned and not going out much. Carrie said we would get up a little special party. As young Mutlar showed no inclination to go, and it was approaching 11 o'clock, as a hint I reminded Lupin that he had to be up early tomorrow morning. Instead of taking the hint, Mutlar began a series of comic imitations. He went on for an hour without cessation. Poor Carrie could scarcely keep her eyes open. At last she made an excuse and said good night. Mutlar then left, and I heard him and Lupin whispering in the hall something about the Holloway comedians. And, to my disgust, although it was past midnight, Lupin put on his hat and coat and went out with his new companion. November 9th. My endeavours to discover who tore the sheets out of my diary still fruitless. Lupin has Daisy Mutlar on the brain, so we see little of him, except that he invariably turns up at meal-times. Cummings dropped in. November 10th. Lupin seems to like his new berth. That's a comfort. Daisy Mutlar the sole topic of conversation during tea. Carrie almost as full of it as Lupin. Lupin informs me to my disgust that he has been persuaded to take part in the forthcoming performance of the Holloway comedians. He says he is to play Bob Britches in the farce Gone to My Uncle's. Frank Mutlar is going to play Old Musty. I told Lupin pretty plainly I was not in the least degree interested in the matter, and totally disapproved of amateur theatricals. Gowing came in the evening. November 11th. Returned home to find the house in a most disgraceful uproar. Carrie, who appeared very frightened, was standing outside her bedroom, while Sarah was excited and crying. Mrs. Birrell, the charwoman, who had evidently been drinking, was shouting at the top of her voice that she was no thief, that she was a respectable woman, who had to work hard for her living, and she would smack anyone's face who put lies into her mouth. Lupin, whose back was towards me, did not hear me come in. He was standing between the two women, and, I regret to say, in his endeavour to act as peacemaker, he made use of rather strong language in the presence of his mother. And I was just in time to hear him say, "And all this fuss about the loss of a few pages from a rotten diary that wouldn't fetch 3 halfpence a pound." I said, quietly, "Pardon me, Lupin, that is a matter of opinion, and as I am master of this house, perhaps you will allow me to take the reins." I ascertained that the cause of the row was that Sarah had accused Mrs. Birrell of tearing the pages out of my diary to wrap up some kitchen fat and leavings, which she had taken out of the house last week. Mrs. Birrell had slapped Sarah's face and said she had taken nothing out of the place. There was never no leavings to take. I ordered Sarah back to her work and requested Mrs. Birrell to go home. When I entered the parlour, Lupin was kicking his legs in the air and roaring with laughter. November 12th, Sunday. Coming home from church, Carrie and I met Lupin, Daisy Mutlar and her brother. Daisy was introduced to us, and we walked home together, Carrie walking on with Miss Mutlar. We asked them in for a few minutes, and I had a good look at my future daughter-in-law. My heart quite sank. She is a big young woman, and I should think at least 8 years older than Lupin. I did not even think her good-looking. Carrie asked her if she could come in on Wednesday next with her brother to meet a few friends. She replied that she would only be too pleased. November the 13th, Carrie sent out invitations to Gowing, the Cummings, to Mr. and Mrs. James of Sutton, and Mr. Stillbrook. I wrote a note to Mr. Franching of Peckham. Carrie said we may as well make it a nice affair, and why not ask our principal, Mr. Perkupp? I said I feared we were not quite grand enough for him. Carrie said there was no offence in asking him. I said certainly not, and wrote him a letter. Carrie confessed she was a little disappointed with Daisy Mutlar's appearance, but thought she seemed a nice girl. November the 14th. Everybody so far has accepted for our quite grand little party for tomorrow. Mr. Perkupp, in a nice letter which I shall keep, wrote that he was dining in Kensington, but if he could get away, he would come up to Holloway for an hour. Carrie was busy all day making little cakes and open jam puffs and jellies. She said she felt quite nervous about her responsibilities tomorrow evening. We decided to have some light things on the table, such as sandwiches, cold chicken and ham, and some sweets, and on the sideboard a nice piece of cold beef and a paysandu tongue for the more hungry ones to peg into if they liked. Gowing called to know if he was to put on swallow-tails tomorrow. Carrie said he had better dress, especially as Mr. Franching was coming, and there's a possibility of Mr. Perkupp also putting in an appearance. Gowing said, "Oh, I only wanted to know, for I've not worn my dress coat for some time, and I must send it to have the creases pressed out." After Gowing left, Lupin came in, and in his anxiety to please Daisy Mutlar, carped at and criticised the arrangements, and, in fact, disapproved of everything, including our having asked our old friend Cummings, who, he said, would look in evening dress like a greengrocer engaged to wait, and who must not be surprised if Daisy took him for one. I fairly lost my temper and said, "Lupin, allow me to tell you, Miss Daisy Mutlar is not the Queen of England. I gave you credit for more wisdom than to allow yourself to be inveigled into an engagement with a woman considerably older than yourself. I advise you to think of earning your living before entangling yourself with a wife whom you will have to support, and, in all probability, her brother also, who appeared to be nothing but a loafer." Instead of receiving this advice in a sensible manner, Lupin jumped up and said, "If you insult the lady I am engaged to, you insult me. I will leave the house and never darken your doors again." He went out of the house, slamming the hall door. But it was all right. He came back to supper, and we played bézique till nearly 12 o'clock. End of chapter. The Diary of a Nobody by George and Weedon Grossmith, read for LibriVox.org by Martin Clifton. Chapter 9. Our first important party. Old friends and new friends. Gowing is a little annoying, but his friend Mr. Stillbrook turns out to be quite amusing. Inopportune arrival of Mr. Perkupp, but he is most kind and complimentary. Party a great success. November the 15th. A red letter day. Our first important party since we have been in this house. I got home early from the city. Lupin insisted on having a hired waiter, and stood half a dozen of champagne. I think this is an unnecessary expense, but Lupin said he had had a piece of luck, having made £3 out of a private deal in the city. I hope he won't gamble in his new situation. The supper-room looked so nice, and Carrie truly said we need not be ashamed of its being seen by Mr. Perkupp, should he honour us by coming. I dressed early in case people should arrive punctually at 8 o'clock, and was much vexed to find my new dress trousers much too short. Lupin, who is getting beyond his position, found a fault with my wearing ordinary boots instead of dress boots. I replied satirically, "My dear son, I have lived to be above that sort of thing." Lupin burst out laughing, and said, "A man generally was above his boots." This may be funny, or it may not, but I was gratified to find he had not discovered the coral had come off one of my studs. Carrie looked a picture, wearing the dress she wore at the Mansion House. The arrangement of the drawing-room was excellent. Carrie had hung muslin curtains over the folding doors, and also over one of the entrances, for we had removed the door from its hinges. Mr. Peters, the waiter, arrived in good time, and I gave him strict orders not to open another bottle of champagne until the previous one was empty. Carrie arranged for some sherry and port wine to be placed on the drawing-room sideboard, with some glasses. By the by, our new enlarged and tinted photographs look very nice on the walls, especially as Carrie has arranged some Liberty silk bows on the four corners of them. The first arrival was Gowing, who, with his usual taste, greeted me with, "Hello, Pooter, why, your trousers are too short." I simply said, "Very likely, and you will find my temper short also." He said, "That won't make your trousers longer, Juggins. You should get your missus to put a flounce on them." I wonder I waste my time entering his insulting observations in my diary. The next arrivals were Mr. and Mrs. Cummings. The former said, "As you didn't say anything about dress, I have come half-dress." He had on a black frock coat and a white tie. The James, Mr. Merton and Mr. Stillbrook arrived, but Lupin was restless and unbearable till his Daisy Mutlar and Frank arrived. Carrie and I were rather startled at Daisy's appearance. She had a bright crimson dress on, cut very low in the neck. I do not think such a style modest. She ought to have taken a lesson from Carrie and covered her shoulders with a little lace. Mr. Knackles, Mr. Sprice-Hogg and his 4 daughters came. So did Franching and one or two of Lupin's new friends, members of the Holloway comedians. Some of these seemed rather theatrical in their manner, especially one who was posing all the evening, and leant on our little round table and cracked it. Lupin called him our Henry, and said he was our lead at the H.C.'s, and was quite as good in that department as Frank Mutlar was as the low comedy merchant. All this is Greek to me. We had some music, and Lupin, who never left Daisy's side for a moment, raved over her singing of a song called "Some Day." It seemed a pretty song, but she made such grimaces and sang to my mind so out of tune, I would not have asked her to sing again. But Lupin made her sing 4 songs right off, one after the other. At 10 o'clock we went down to supper, and from the way Gowing and Cummings ate, you would have thought they had not had a meal for a month. I told Carrie to keep coming back in case Mr. Perkupp should come by mere chance. Gowing annoyed me very much by filling a large tumbler of champagne and drinking it straight off. He repeated this action, and made me fear our half-dozen of champagne would not last out. I tried to keep a bottle back, but Lupin got hold of it and took it to the side table with Daisy and Frank Mutlar. We went upstairs, and the young fellows began skylarking. Carrie put a stop to that at once. Stillbrook amused us with a song. "What have you done with your cousin John?" I did not notice that Lupin and Frank had disappeared. I asked Mr. Watson, one of the Holloways, where they were, and he said, "It's a case of 'Oh, what a surprise!'" We were directed to form a circle, which we did. Watson then said, "I have much pleasure in introducing the celebrated Blondin Donkey." Frank and Lupin then bounded into the room. Lupin had whitened his face like a clown, and Frank had tied round his waist a large hearthrug. He was supposed to be the donkey, and he looked it. They indulged in a very noisy pantomime, and we were all shrieking with laughter. I turned round suddenly, and then I saw Mr. Perkupp standing halfway in the door, he having arrived without our knowing it. I beckoned to Carrie, and we went up to him at once. He would not come right into the room. I apologised for the foolery, but Mr. Perkupp said, "Oh, it seems amusing." I could see he was not a bit amused. Carrie and I took him downstairs, but the table was a wreck. There was not a glass of champagne left, not even a sandwich. Mr. Perkupp said he required nothing, but would like a glass of seltzer or soda water. The last siphon was empty. Carrie said, "We have plenty of port wine left." Mr. Perkupp said with a smile, "No, thank you, I really require nothing, but I am most pleased to see you and your husband in your own home. Good night, Mrs. Pooter. You will excuse my very short stay, I know." I went with him to his carriage, and he said, "Don't trouble to come to the office till 12 to-morrow." I felt despondent as I walked back to the house, and I told Carrie I thought the party was a failure. Carrie said it was a great success, and I was only tired, and insisted on my having some port myself. I drank 2 glasses and felt much better, and we went into the drawing-room, where they had commenced dancing. Carrie and I had a little dance, which I said reminded me of old days. She said I was a spoony old thing. End of chapter. The Diary of a Nobody by George and Weedon Grossmith, read for LibriVox.org by Martin Clifton. Chapter 10. Reflections. I make another good joke. Am annoyed at the constant serving up of the blancmange. Lupin expresses his opinion of weddings. Lupin falls out with Daisy Mutler. November the 16th. Woke up about 20 times during the night with terrible thirst. Finished off all the water in the bottle, as well as half that in the jug. Kept dreaming also that last night's party was a failure, and that a lot of low people came without invitation, and kept chaffing and throwing things at Mr. Perkupp, till at last I was obliged to hide him in the box-room, which we had just discovered, with a bath-towel over him. It seems absurd now, but it was painfully real in the dream. I had the same dream about a dozen times. Carrie annoyed me by saying, "You know champagne never agrees with you." I told her I had only a couple of glasses of it, having kept myself entirely to port. I added that good champagne hurt nobody, and Lupin told me he had only got it from a traveller as a favour, as that particular brand had been entirely bought up by a West End club. I think I ate too heartily of the side dishes, as the waiter called them. I said to Carrie, I wish I had put those side dishes aside. I repeated this, but Carrie was busy packing up the teaspoons we had borrowed of Mrs. Cummings for the party. It was just 11:30, and I was starting for the office when Lupin appeared with a yellow complexion and said, "Hello, Gov. What priced head have you got this morning?" I told him he might just as well speak to me in Dutch. He added, "When I woke this morning my head was as big as Baldwin's balloon." On the spur of the moment, I said the cleverest thing I think I have ever said, viz., "Perhaps that accounts for the parachuting pains." We all three roared. November the 17th. Still feel tired and headachy. In the evening Gowing called, and was full of praise about our party last Wednesday. He said everything was done beautifully, and he enjoyed himself enormously. Gowing can be a very nice fellow when he likes, but you never know how long it will last. For instance, he stopped to supper, and seeing some blancmange on the table, shouted out, while the servant was in the room, "Hello, the remains of Wednesday?" November the 18th. Woke up quite fresh after a good night's rest, and feel quite myself again. I am satisfied a life of going out and society is not a life for me. We therefore declined the invitation which we received this morning to Miss Bird's wedding. We only met her twice at Mrs. James', and it means a present. Lupin said, "I'm with you for once. To my mind, a wedding's a very poor play. There are only 2 parts in it, the bride and the bridegroom. The best man is only a walking gentleman. With the exception of a crying father and a snivelling mother, the rest are supers, who have to dress well and have to pay for their insignificant parts in the shape of costly presents." I did not care for the theatrical slang, but thought it clever, though disrespectful. I told Sarah not to bring up the blancmange again for breakfast. It seems to have been placed on our table at every meal since Wednesday. Cummings came round in the evening and congratulated us on the success of our party. He said it was the best party he had been to for many a year. But he wished we had let him know it was full dress, as he would have turned up in his swallow-tails. We sat down to a quiet game of dominoes, and were interrupted by the noisy entrance of Lupin and Frank Mutler. Cummings and I asked them to join us. Lupin said he did not care for dominoes, and suggested a game of spoof. On my asking if it required counters, Frank and Lupin in measured time says, 1, 2, 3, go, Have you an estate in Greenland? It was simply Greek to me, but it appears it is one of the customs of the Holloway comedians to do this when a member displays ignorance. In spite of my instructions, that blancmange was brought up again for supper. To make matters worse, there had been an attempt to disguise it by placing it in a glass dish with jam round it. Carrie asked Lupin if he would have some, and he replied, "No second-hand goods for me, thank you." I told Carrie, when we were alone, if that blancmange were placed on the table again, I should walk out of the house. November the 19th, Sunday. A delightfully quiet day. In the afternoon, Lupin was off to spend the rest of the day with the Mutlars. He departed in the best of spirits, and Carrie said, "Well, one advantage of Lupin's engagement with Daisy is that the boy seems happy all day long. That quite reconciles me to what I must confess seems an imprudent engagement." Carrie and I talked the matter over during the evening, and agreed that it did not always follow that an early engagement meant an unhappy marriage. Dear Carrie reminded me that we had married early, and, with the exception of a few trivial misunderstandings, we had never had a really serious word. I could not help thinking, as I told her, that half the pleasures of life were derived from the little struggles and small privations that one had to endure at the beginning of one's married life. Such struggles were generally occasioned by want of means, and often helped to make loving couples stand together all the firmer. Carrie said I had expressed myself wonderfully well, and that I was quite a philosopher. We are all vain at times, and I must confess I felt flattered by Carrie's little compliment. I don't pretend to be able to express myself in fine language, but I feel I have the power of expressing my thoughts with simplicity and lucidness. About 9 o'clock, to our surprise, Lupin entered with a wild, reckless look, and in a hollow voice, which I must say seemed rather theatrical, said, "Have you any brandy?" I said, "No, but here is some whisky." Lupin drank off nearly a wineglassful without water, to my horror. We all three sat reading in silence till 10, when Carrie and I rose to go to bed. Carrie said to Lupin, "I hope Daisy is well?" Lupin, with a forced, careless air that he must have picked up from the Holloway comedians, replied, "Oh, Daisy, you mean Miss Mutlar. I don't know whether she's well or not, but please never to mention her name again in my presence." End of chapter. The Diary of a Nobody by George and Weedon Grossmith. Read for LibriVox.org by Martin Clifton. Chapter 11. We have a dose of Irving imitations, make the acquaintance of a Mr. Padge, don't care for him, Mr. Burwin Fosselton becomes a nuisance. November the 20th. Have seen nothing of Lupin the whole day. Bought a cheap address book. I spent the evening copying in the names and addresses of my friends and acquaintances. Left out the Mutlars, of course. November the 21st. Lupin turned up for a few minutes in the evening. He asked for a drop of brandy with a sort of careless look, which to my mind was theatrical and quite ineffective. I said, "My boy, I have none, and I don't think I should give it you if I had." Lupin said, "I'll go where I can get some," and walked out of the house. Carrie took the boy's part, and the rest of the evening was spent in a disagreeable discussion in which the words Daisy and Mutlar must have occurred 1,000 times. November the 22nd. Gowing and Cummings dropped in during the evening. Lupin also came in, bringing his friend Mr. Burwin Fosselton, one of the Holloway comedians, who was at our party the other night and who cracked our little round table. Happy to say Daisy Mutlar was never referred to. The conversation was almost entirely monopolised by the young fellow Fosselton, who not only looked rather like Mr. Irving, but seemed to imagine that he was the celebrated actor. I must say he gave some capital imitations of him. As he showed no signs of moving at supper time, I said, "If you like to stay, Mr. Fosselton, for our usual crust, pray do." He replied, "Oh, thanks, but please call me Burwin Fosselton. It's a double name. There are lots of Fosseltons, but please call me Burwin Fosselton." He began doing the Irving business all through supper. He sank so low down in his chair that his chin was almost on a level with the table, and twice he kicked Carrie under the table, upset his wine, and flashed a knife uncomfortably near Gowing's face. After supper he kept stretching out his legs on the fender, indulging in scraps of quotations from plays, which were Greek to me, and more than once knocked over the fire-irons, making a hideous row, poor Carrie already having a bad headache. When he went, he said, to our surprise, "I will come to-morrow and bring my Irving make-up." Gowing and Cummings said they would like to see it, and would come too. I could not help thinking they might as well give a party at my house while they were about it. However, as Carrie sensibly said, do anything, dear, to make Lupin forget the Daisy Mutlar business. November 23rd. In the evening, Cummings came early. Gowing came a little later and brought, without asking permission, a fat and, I think, very vulgar-looking man named Padge, who appeared to be all moustache. Gowing never attempted any apology to either of us, but said Padge wanted to see the Irving business. To which Padge said, "That's right," and that is about all he did say during the entire evening. Lupin came in and seemed in much better spirits. He had prepared a bit of a surprise. Mr. Burwin Fosselton had come in with him, but had gone upstairs to get ready. In half an hour Lupin retired from the parlour, and, returning in a few minutes, announced Mr. Henry Irving. I must say we were all astounded. I never saw such a resemblance. It was astonishing. The only person who did not appear interested was the man Padge, who had got the best arm-chair and was puffing away at a foul pipe into the fireplace. After some little time I said, "Why do actors always wear their hair so long?" Carrie in a moment said, "Mr. Hare doesn't wear long hair." How we laughed, except Mr. Fosselton, who said, in a rather patronising kind of way, "The joke, Mrs. Pooter, is extremely appropriate, if not altogether new." Thinking this rather a snub, I said, "Mr. Fosselton, I fancy—" He interrupted me by saying, "Mr. Burwin Fosselton, if you please," which made me quite forget what I was going to say to him. During the supper, Mr. Burwin Fosselton again monopolised the conversation with his Irving talk, and both Carrie and I came to the conclusion one can have even too much imitation of Irving. After supper, Mr. Burwin Fosselton got a little too boisterous over his Irving imitation, and suddenly seizing Gowing by the collar of his coat, dug his thumbnail, accidentally of course, into Gowing's neck and took a piece of flesh out. Gowing was rightly annoyed, but that man Padge, who, having declined our modest supper in order that he should not lose his comfortable chair, burst into an uncontrollable fit of laughter at the little misadventure. I was so annoyed at the conduct of Padge, I said, "I suppose you would have laughed if he had poked Mr. Gowing's eye out?" To which Padge replied, "That's right," and laughed more than ever. I think perhaps the greatest surprise was when we broke up, for Mr. Burwin Fosselton said, "Good night, Mr. Pooter. I'm glad you liked the imitation. I'll bring the other make-up to-morrow night." November 24th. I went to town without a pocket-handkerchief. This is the second time I've done this during the last week. I must be losing my memory. Had it not been for this Daisy Mutlar business, I would have written to Mr. Burwin Fosselton and told him I should be out this evening. But I fancy he's the sort of young man who would come all the same. Dear old Cummings came in the evening, but Gowing sent round a little note saying he hoped I would excuse his not turning up, which rather amused me. He added that his neck was still painful. Of course, Burwin Fosselton came, but Lupin never turned up, and imagine my utter disgust when the man Padge actually came again, and not even accompanied by Gowing. I was exasperated, and said, "Mr. Padge, this is a surprise." Dear Carrie, fearing unpleasantness, said, "Oh, I suppose Mr. Padge has only come to see the other Irving make-up." Mr. Padge said, "That's right," and took the best chair again, for which he never moved the whole evening. My only consolation is, he takes no supper, so he's not an expensive guest, but I shall speak to Gowing about the matter. The Irving imitations and conversations occupied the whole evening, till I was sick of it. Once we had a rather heated discussion, which was commenced by Cummings saying that it appeared to him that Mr. Burwin Fosselton was not only like Mr. Irving, but was, in his judgment, every way as good or even better. I ventured to remark that, after all, it was but an imitation of an original. Cummings said surely some imitations were better than the originals. I made what I considered a very clever remark. Without an original there can be no imitation. Mr. Burwin Fosselton said, quite impertinently, "Don't discuss me in my presence, if you please, and, Mr. Pooter, I should advise you to talk about what you understand." To which that cad Padge replied, "That's right." Dear Carrie saved the whole thing by suddenly saying, "I'll be Ellen Terry." Dear Carrie's imitation wasn't a bit liked, but she was so spontaneous and so funny that the disagreeable discussion passed off. When they left, I very pointedly said to Mr. Burwin Fosselton and Mr. Padge that we should be engaged tomorrow evening. November the 25th. Had a long letter from Mr. Fosselton respecting last night's Irving discussion. I was very angry, and I wrote and said I knew little or nothing about stage matters, was not in the least interested in them, and positively declined to be drawn into a discussion on the subject, even at the risk of its leading to a breach of friendship. I never wrote a more determined letter. On returning home at the usual hour on Saturday afternoon, I met, near the archway, Daisy Mutlar. My heart gave a leap. I bowed rather stiffly, but she affected not to have seen me. Very much annoyed in the evening by the laundress sending home an odd sock. Sarah said she sent 2 pairs, and the laundress declared only a pair and a half were sent. I spoke to Carrie about it, but she rather testily replied, "I'm tired of speaking to her. You had better go and speak to her yourself. She's outside." I did so, but the laundress declared that only an odd sock was sent. Gowing passed into the passage at this time, and was rude enough to listen to the conversation, and, interrupting, said, "Don't waste the odd sock, old man. Do an act of charity and give it to some poor man with only one leg." The laundress giggled like an idiot. I was disgusted, and walked upstairs for the purpose of pinning down my collar as the button had come off the back of my shirt. When I returned to the parlour, Gowing was retailing his idiotic joke about the odd sock, and Carrie was roaring with laughter. I suppose I am losing my sense of humour. I spoke my mind pretty freely about Padge. Gowing said he had met him only once before that evening. He had been introduced by a friend, and as he, Padge, had stood a good dinner, Gowing wished to show him some little return. Upon my word, Gowing's coolness surpasses all belief. Lupin came in before I could reply, and Gowing unfortunately inquired after Daisy Mutlar. Lupin shouted, "Mind your own business, sir," and bounced out of the room, slamming the door. The remainder of the night was Daisy Mutlar, Daisy Mutlar, Daisy Mutlar. Oh dear. November the 26th, Sunday. The curate preached a very good sermon to-day, very good indeed. His appearance is never so impressive as our dear old vicar's, but I am bound to say his sermons are much more impressive. A rather annoying incident occurred, of which I must make mention. Mrs. Fernloss, who is quite a grand lady, living in one of those large houses in the Camden Road, stopped to speak to me after church, when we were all coming out. I must say I felt flattered, for she is thought a good deal of. I suppose she knew me through seeing me so often take round the plate, especially as she always occupies the corner seat of the pew. She is a very influential lady, and may have had something of the utmost importance to say. But unfortunately, as she commenced to speak, a strong gust of wind came and blew my hat off into the middle of the road. I had to run after it, and had the greatest difficulty in recovering it. When I had succeeded in doing so, I found Mrs. Fernloss had walked on with some swell friends, and I felt I could not well approach her now, especially as my hat was smothered with mud. I cannot say how disappointed I felt. In the evening, Sunday evening of all others, I found an impertinent note from Mr. Burwin Fosselton, which ran as follows: "Dear Mr. Pooter, although your junior by perhaps some 20 or 30 years, which is sufficient reason that you ought to have a longer record of the things and ways in this miniature of a planet, I feel it is just within the bounds of possibility that the wheels of your life don't travel so quickly round as those of the humble writer of these lines. The dandy horse of past days has been known to overtake the slow coach. Do I make myself understood? Very well, then. Permit me, Mr. Pooter, to advise you to accept the verb sap. Acknowledge your defeat and take your whipping gracefully. For remember, you threw down the glove, and I cannot claim to be either mentally or physically a coward. Revenons à nos moutons. Our lives run in different grooves. I live for my art, the stage. Your life is devoted to commercial pursuits, a life among ledgers. My books are of different metal. Your life in the city is honourable, I admit, but how different! Cannot even you see the ocean between us, a channel that prevents the meeting of our brains in harmonious accord? Ah, but chacun a son goût. I have registered a vow to mount the steps of fame. I may crawl, I may slip, I may even falter. We are all weak. But reach the top rung of the ladder I will. When there, my voice shall be heard, for I will shout to the multitudes below, Vici. For the present, I am only an amateur, and my work is unknown, forsooth, save to a party of friends, with here and there an enemy. But, Mr. Pooter, let me ask you, what is the difference between the amateur and the professional? None. Stay, yes, there is a difference. One is paid for doing what the other does as skilfully for nothing. But I will be paid too, for I, contrary to the wishes of my family and friends, have at last elected to adopt the stage as my profession. And when the farce craze is over, and mark you, that will be soon, I will make my power known, for I feel, pardon my apparent conceit, that there is no living man who can play the hump-backed Richard as I feel and know I can. And you will be the first to come round and bend your head in submission. There are many matters you may understand, but knowledge of the fine art of acting is to you an unknown quantity. Pray let this discussion cease with this letter. Vale. Yours truly, Burwin Fosselton. I was disgusted. When Lupin came in, I handed him this impertinent letter and said, "My boy, in that letter you can see the true character of your friend." Lupin, to my surprise, said, "Oh yes, he showed me the letter before he sent it. I think he's right, and you ought to apologise." End of chapter. The Diary of a Nobody by George and Weedon Grossmith, read for LibriVox.org by Martin Clifton. Chapter 12. A serious discussion concerning the use and value of my diary. Lupin's opinion of Xmas. Lupin's unfortunate engagement is on again. December the 17th. As I open my scribbling diary, I find the words "Oxford Michaelmas term ends." Why this should induce me to indulge in retrospective, I don't know, but it does. The last few weeks of my diary are of minimum interest. The breaking off of the engagement between Lupin and Daisy Mutlar has made him a different being, and Carrie a rather depressing companion. She was a little dull last Saturday, and I thought to cheer her up by reading some extracts from my diary. But she walked out of the room in the middle of the reading, without a word. On her return, I said, "Did my diary bore you, darling?" She replied, to my surprise, "I really wasn't listening, dear. I was obliged to leave to give instructions to the laundress. In consequence of some stuff she puts in the water, 2 more of Lupin's coloured shirts have run, and he says he won't wear them." I said, "Everything is Lupin. It's all Lupin, Lupin, Lupin. There was not a single button on my shirt yesterday, but I made no complaint." Carrie simply replied, "You should do as all other men do, and wear studs. In fact, I never saw anyone but you wear buttons on the shirt fronts." I said, "I certainly wore none yesterday, for there were none on." Another thought that strikes me is that Gowing seldom calls in the evening, and Cummings never does. I fear they don't get on well with Lupin. December the 18th. Yesterday I was in retrospective vein. Today it is prospective. I see nothing but clouds, clouds, clouds. Lupin is perfectly intolerable over the Daisy Mutlar business. He won't say what is the cause of the breach. He is evidently condemning her conduct, and yet, if we venture to agree with him, says he won't hear a word against her. So what is one to do? Another thing which is disappointing to me is that Carrie and Lupin take no interest whatever in my diary. I broached the subject at the breakfast table today. I said I was in hopes that, if anything ever happened to me, the diary would be an endless source of pleasure to you both, to say nothing of the chance of the remuneration which may accrue from its being published. Both Carrie and Lupin burst out laughing. Carrie was sorry for this, I could see, for she said, "I did not mean to be rude, dear Charlie, but truly I do not think your diary would sufficiently interest the public to be taken up by a publisher." I replied, I am sure it would prove quite as interesting as some of the ridiculous reminiscences that have been published lately. Besides, it's the diary that makes the man. Where would Evelyn and Pepys have been if it had not been for their diaries? Carrie said I was quite a philosopher, but Lupin, in a jeering tone, said if it had been written on a larger paper, Gov, we might get a fair price from a butterman for it. As I am in the prospective vein, I vow the end of this year will see the end of my diary. December the 19th. The annual invitation came to spend Christmas with Carrie's mother, the usual family festive gathering to which we always look forward. Lupin declined to go. I was astounded and expressed my surprise and disgust. Lupin then obliged us with the following radical speech. "I hate a family gathering at Christmas. What does it mean? Why, someone says, 'Ah, we miss poor Uncle James, who was here last year,' and we all begin to snivel. Someone else says, 'It's 2 years since poor Aunt Liz used to sit in that corner.' Then we all begin to snivel again. Then another gloomy relation says, 'Ah, I wonder whose turn it will be next.' Then we all snivel again, and proceed to eat and drink too much, and they don't discover until I get up that we have been seated 13 at dinner." December the 20th. Went to Smirkson's the drapers in the Strand, who this year have turned out everything in the shop and devoted the whole place to the sale of Christmas cards. Shop crowded with people who seemed to take up the cards rather roughly, and, after a hurried glance at them, throw them down again. I remarked to one of the young persons serving that carelessness appeared to be a disease with some purchasers. The observation was scarcely out of my mouth when my thick coat-sleeve caught against a large pile of expensive cards in boxes, one on top of the other, and threw them down. The manager came forward looking very much annoyed, and, picking up several cards from the ground, said to one of the assistants, with a palpable side glance at me, "Put these amongst the sixpenny goods. They can't be sold for a shilling now." The result was I felt it my duty to buy some of these damaged cards. I had to buy more and pay more than intended. Unfortunately, I did not examine them all, and when I got home I discovered a vulgar card with a picture of a fat nurse with 2 babies, one black and the other white, and the words, "We wish Pa a Merry Christmas." I tore up the card and threw it away. Carrie said the great disadvantage of going out in society and increasing the number of our friends was that we should have to send out nearly 24 cards this year. December the 21st. To save the postman a miserable Christmas, we followed the example of all unselfish people and sent out our cards early. Most of the cards had finger marks, which I did not notice at night. I shall buy all future cards in the daytime. Lupin, who ever since he has had the appointment with a stock and share broker does not seem over-scrupulous in his dealings, told me never to rub out the pencilled price on the backs of the cards. I asked him why. Lupin said, "Suppose your card is marked 9d. Well, all you have to do is to pencil a 3 and a long downstroke after it in front of the 9d, and people will think you've given 5 times the price for it." In the evening Lupin was very low-spirited, and I reminded him that behind the cloud the sun was shining. He said, "Ugh, it never shines on me." I said, "Stop, Lupin, my boy. You are worried about Daisy Mutlar. Don't think of her any more. You ought to congratulate yourself on having got off a very bad bargain. Her notions are far too grand for our simple tastes." He jumped up and said, "I won't allow one word to be uttered against her. She's worth the whole bunch of your friends put together, that inflated, sloping head of a Perkupp included." I left the room with silent dignity, but caught my foot in the mat. December 23rd. I exchanged no words with Lupin in the morning, but as he seemed to be in exuberant spirits in the evening, I ventured to ask him where he intended to spend his Christmas. He replied, "Oh, most likely at the Mutlars'." In wonderment, I said, "What? After your engagement has been broken off?" Lupin said, "Who said it's off?" I said, "You have given us both to understand..." He interrupted me by saying, "Well, never mind what I said. It's on again. There." End of chapter.